Speaker is Dr. Vince Scappatura, who teaches politics and international relations at Macquarie University. His latest book is The US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy. Vince was a panel member for the IPAN People's Inquiry between 2020 and 2022. Together, Richard and Vince will present their extremely important findings from their 18-month study into the upcoming deployment of B-52 bombers to the RAAF Base Tindal and the strategic implications for Australia. But first is Dr. Scappatura, Vince, talking about where we are and where we are headed. Thank you. Vince, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kelly, and thank you very much, Gareth, for that very comprehensive rebuttal of AUKUS on strategic and economic and most importantly, national sovereignty and ultimately national interest grounds. I'm going to, as Kelly mentioned, change tack slightly by shifting the discussion to other elements of Australia's integration into US warfighting. Gareth mentioned that one particular element of, a very important element of the AUKUS deal is not so much the question around whether Australia needs nuclear-powered submarines or not, but the AUKUS framework within which the nuclear-powered submarines are being acquired and the implications for Australia's sovereignty. And Gareth mentioned the expectations, the very clear expectations from the Americans that Australia will participate in the Biden administration's term of integrated deterrence. I want to focus on one particular element of integrated deterrence, integrated nuclear deterrence in particular. And on that note, although there are important nuclear warfighting elements to AUKUS, even though they are conventionally armed with nuclear-powered submarines, the most important developments are in fact non-AUKUS related, and they are signalled by what Kelly mentioned in her introduction, the US Force Posture Initiatives, in particular, more frequent rotations of US strategic bombers in Northern Australia, but especially the infrastructure upgrades. And at Tindal Air Force Base in the Northern Territory, in particular, to accommodate the forward basing of up to 6 B-52 strategic bombers and most likely other strategic bombers as well. And what I'm going to argue is that these developments together signal the development of, shaping of, a new nuclear defence posture for Australia, new ways in which Australia is likely to be expected to support US nuclear warfighting in any potential future conflict. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about why it's a significant departure from where we've come from in the past, and I'm also going to discuss briefly where I think we may be headed. And then after doing the very easy job of explaining what a great big mess we're in, I'm going to turn over to Richard, who has the much harder job of explaining how we might get out of it, or at the very least, what needs to be done, what should be done at the present moment. Okay, so there are nuclear warfighting dimensions of AUKUS. I think it's important to point out. It's conceivable that Australia's future nuclear-powered submarines will be involved in hunter-killer operations against Chinese SSBNs, Chinese nuclear-armed submarines. It's possible that Australian future nuclear-powered submarines will be involved in operations against conventional Chinese armed submarines in order to help free up the US Navy to undertake operations against Chinese nuclear-armed submarines, which of course is a very significant concern for the Chinese, given that nuclear-armed submarines are often a guaranteed second strike capability. It's also conceivable that the American Virginia attack class submarines that will be rotating through, operating from the new base or the new upgraded base at HMAS Sterling could one day be nuclear armed. US attack class submarines are not nuclear armed at present. They haven't been since 1991. But that could change. It could change at the with a new presidential directive. It was a presidential directive which removed those nuclear arms from attack submarines, and it could be a presidential directive which redeploys them. And in fact, there is funding authorised by Congress for the development of a new submarine-launched cruise nuclear missile, which could in the future be redeployed to attack submarines. So there are possibilities, conceivable possibilities for nuclear dimensions as part of the integrated nuclear deterrence that Gareth was talking about with AUKUS. But as I mentioned, I actually don't think that, at least in the short to medium term, that's where the most important and significant developments are. The significant developments are in the more frequent bomber rotations, but in particular the dedicated air base infrastructure upgrades, and most significantly at Tindal. This is important too because when asked about the potential implications, not just of AUKUS, but particularly the B-52s, the government's response is just to play this down. In fact, not just play it down, but be misleading about it. When Miles, for example, is asked about the significance of the B-52s, his response is, oh, well, you know, we've had B-52s visit Australia for a long period of time, you know, since the 1980s. And although that's true, it's one thing to have US strategic bombers visit Australia for interoperability and to train in our practice long range bombing runs in the Northern Territory. It's quite another when we have dedicated infrastructure, the Squadrons Operation Facility that Kellie mentioned before, for mission planning, for crew briefings, for intelligence support, along with fuel reserves and tanker aircraft and the stockpiling of weapons and so forth, which mean that for the first time in Australia's history, we have the possibility of US nuclear combat operations being launched from Australian territory. This is very different to the past. Australia has played a very significant role and continues to in US nuclear warfighting, deterrence, through intelligence and communication support, namely through, of course, Pine Gap, also Northwest Cape. It's very significant. There are issues there to contend with that are important, but these are non-kinetic support for US nuclear warfighting operations, intelligence, communications. What we're talking about now, with the dedicated facilities, with the possibility of combat operations from Australian soil, is very different, and I think does signify the development, the shaping of a potentially new type of Australian support for US nuclear warfighting. The one way that the government has, the Albanese government has, and the Morrison government prior to that has been misleading about this, is to downplay its significance. But the other way, long-standing way, the government has obfuscated on this issue is, when asked about, will these B-52 bombers be nuclear armed, or even will the B-52 bombers be nuclear capable? Not all B-52s are in fact nuclear capable. Some are conventional only. When asked this question, the government's response is, well, the US has a long-standing policy of neither confirming nor denying whether there are nuclear weapons on aircraft, ships, and so forth. We respect and understand and adhere to that. That's the first element of the first way that the Albanese government kind of hides behind this issue. The second way is to say, look, be that as it may, US bombers don't usually fly with nuclear weapons on board in peacetime. And thirdly, it then cites the Rarotonga Treaty. Australia is a party to the Rarotonga Treaty, the Nuclear Southwest Pacific Zone Free Zone, that prohibits nuclear weapons from being stationed on Australian territory. The United States respects our position on that. Therefore, there is no real issue here. Well, what's missing from that explanation is that, yes, the Rarotonga Treaty prohibits the stationing of nuclear weapons on Australian territory. It does not prohibit transiting or visiting of nuclear weapons on board US aircraft, US strategic bombers or ships. So there are no legal or policy impediments to the possibility of nuclear operations, combat operations being launched from Australia or US strategic bombers having nuclear weapons on board. Now, it is true, as Miles has said and others, that in normal peacetime operations, the strategic bombers are not armed with nuclear weapons. Americans don't do it, the Russians don't do it, it's just too dangerous. It was the case during the Cold War, but not anymore. Of course, that situation can change in the midst of a crisis. If there were a significant security crisis, a potential war, on the brink of a potential war between the United States and China, then those nuclear bombers could be armed with nuclear weapons, and there would not be any significant legal policy impediments for them continuing to rotate through Australia in that event. And so on that note, as Kellie mentioned, Richard and I recently published a special report with the Nautilus Institute, which provides a visual guide which enables readers to be able to distinguish between the conventional only B-52s that I mentioned and the nuclear capable B-52s. Again, when the government's asked about this question, they refuse to offer any transparency, referring again to the policy of neither confirm nor deny. So we hope that this paper will provide a small measure of transparency and accountability, so that when these, we have B-52 bombers and other strategic bombers rotating through Australian bases now, but particularly when the ones to Tindal Air Force Base come through, we'll be able to know whether these bombers are nuclear capable, whether the US is sending nuclear capable or conventional only bombers. And the strategic implications of each of those, of course, is very different. You would think it would be important for the Australian public to know that, but we're not going to be told by the US government and not our own government, it seems. So that's kind of the purpose or the rationale or the hope of the paper that Richard and I recently published. Okay, so just in the few remaining minutes that I have, I want to talk about where I think we could be headed. Because as bad as things are at the moment, they could get worse. We are not at the situation now, which is equivalent to say, for example, NATO, or even indeed the US and South Korea, in the way in which we are integrated into US nuclear warfighting operations. There are a number of quite prominent and influential strategic defence commentators that are pushing for a kind of NATOization of the Australia-US relationship. And what that would mean in the nuclear domain would be formalising the nuclear relationship by creating policy guidance or joint planning at the policy level that would spell out essentially pre-commitments that Australia would make in support of US nuclear warfighting operations. So with NATO, there is the nuclear planning group, and this involves, of course, those 5 countries that host nuclear weapons to engage in joint planning for the event of a nuclear war, those weapons being released to those countries and being used in nuclear combat operations. But it also involves other NATO countries that don't host US nuclear weapons, but they engage in what are called SNOWCAT operations. SNOWCAT support for nuclear operations with conventional air tactics. And what this means is there are NATO countries which have joint planning pre-commitments to provide conventional support to US nuclear operations, such as air refueling, air protection, early warning and control, early airborne warning and control, base protection, and so on. The United States set up a recent nuclear consultative group for a similar type of arrangement with the Republic of Korea not too long ago. If this were to occur in Australia, then it would involve, as I mentioned, joint planning, explicit nuclear exercises. The kind of interoperability exercises we engage in now are not explicit nuclear planning for nuclear operations. And ultimately, as I mentioned, it would involve pre-commitments on behalf of Australia to provide conventional support to US nuclear combat operations. We are not at that level of planning yet. We have the integration at the operational level to enable such cooperation with the bases, with the dedicated facilities, with the interoperability exercises where Australia is practicing refueling B-52s and other B-2 bombers, where we're providing air protection and early warning command and control and so on. So operationally, we're developing that way, but on the policy level, It's not that developed yet, and that's a good thing. But this could change. In fact, it's already changing. In 2019, there was the Strategic Policy Dialogue that was established between Australia and the United States to have discussions about extended deterrence and presumably extended nuclear deterrence. It's not at the level of NATO or the UK ROC Nuclear Consultative Group, but it could be the foundations to move in that direction. As I said, there are advocates who are pushing for us to move in that way. Now, the Australian government has been reluctant, in fact, to engage in that kind of consultative joint planning for a couple of reasons. The first is the fear of entrapment, and that's very wise. We don't want to be entrapped with pre-commitments to engage in US nuclear warfighting operations. But the other concern is just the likelihood of domestic backlash. The government doesn't want to have a debate about Australian possible participation in extended nuclear deterrence. And it would have to if it publicly revealed this type of consultative formalised policy agreement. It doesn't want to have a debate about AUKUS, a proper strategic debate about AUKUS, let alone the idea of Australian participation in US nuclear warfighting operations. So for these two reasons, it's been reluctant to engage in that way. But as I said, there are forces pushing in that direction. Now, it's better that we don't go in that direction, of course, but the situation now isn't a whole lot better. And that's because, as Gareth mentioned, the kind of operational integration signified by AUKUS sends a very clear expectation to the Americans that we will be there in the ways that they expect, including, I think, in the nuclear domain. Gareth mentioned the type of, the personal experience that he had in coming under pressure from the United States. I mean, you can imagine the kind of pressure that a future Australian government will come under if the US was in the event of a crisis, which could be an existential crisis. It could go nuclear. The kind of pressure the Australian government would come under to allow the United States to use the very significant capabilities that it's built up in Australia, and for Australia to support the kinds of operations that it has been training to support, that has been engaging in such interoperability exercises to support. The Americans very much are getting this message. This was signaled recently by comments by Michael McCall, the head of the chair of the US House of Foreign Affairs Committee, who was in Australia recently, and he bluntly stated that Australia will be a central base of operations for US power projection in the Indo-Pacific. That's the expectation. It's not a coincidence that when US defense think tanks like RAND and others do their wargaming exercises, who are the countries that they assume are going to participate in a US conflict with China? It's Japan and Australia. There are other countries that are maybes, but there's assumed support from us. And so just very quickly to conclude, because I see I've run out of time, if we take AUKUS, if we take the US force posture initiatives, if we take the strategic bomber rotations, if we take the base upgrades, particularly at Tindal, and all the interoperability exercises and so on, what we have here is an emerging new nuclear defence posture for Australia that may very well see Australian direct and active participation in support of US nuclear combat operations in the future. This is very significant. This is new. And there's next to no transparency or accountability or discussion about this in the media, and certainly not by the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince. And I'm sure you've generated quite a few questions in the chat box, which we'll get to at the end. I'll move on, just bearing in